Okay, we're going to make a start. I'd like to welcome everyone, both in the room here and online, to our second event in our 2024 conversation series, which delves into 10 big questions on deliberative democracy. My name is Adele Webb. I'm a research fellow here at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra, and I'm convening this year's special conversation series to mark the Centre's 10th anniversary. And it's also my great pleasure and privilege to chair today's event. First, let me acknowledge and express deep gratitude to the Ngunnawal people, traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Canberra Bruce campus now sits, land that was never ceded, making it still Aboriginal land and part of a history that spans more than 60,000 years. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect and gratitude to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today, and indeed any First Nations peoples from other parts of the world. Today we're asking the question, can deliberative democracy take root in settler colonial states? Now, just so that we are all on the same page, settler colonialism refers to a category of colonisation which happens when foreign settlers arrive in an inhabited territory and appropriate the lands of the Indigenous peoples, the existing residents. It involves genocide, cultural erasure, disruption of connections to land, and this for the formal purpose of the settlers forming a permanent society. As we'll talk more about today, both Australia and New Zealand are examples of settler colonial states. I feel particularly involved in this discussion as I am the direct descendant of two English settlers, convicts, who arrived on the first fleet of 11 ships in 1788 to establish a convict settlement. He, my male ancestor, disembarked earlier in the days following the 26th of January landing in what is now Sydney, she on the 6th of February. They were married on the 7th. Both were prisoners. She, no doubt, the subject of obscene sexual and other abuse. But soon after, they were granted Aboriginal land, as if the place was empty. So began my family's story in Australia, and so began the unleashing of years, decades, and centuries of devastating effects and unaddressed injustices for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Today, for the most part, Australia's origin story is about the creation of a nation of immigrants who share the anti-aristocratic principles of egalitarianism, mateship, and fair go. Stories of its violent historical foundations are either buried altogether or deemed to lie too far in the past. Where scholars and activists are currently making the most impactful interventions, however, is to think about settler colonialism as an ongoing project, one that is not yet complete. And at the same time, scholars and activists are calling for greater attention to ongoing historic Indigenous resistance. In this moment, how should theorists and practitioners of deliberative democracy respond? Can deliberation overcome the foundational myths of liberal democratic societies such as Australia and New Zealand? And if so, how? Today in this conversation, I'm joined by two people extremely well situated to help us engage with these questions. Justin McCaul, who I'm happy to say is here with us in the room, is a descendant of the Mbarbarum Traditional Owners of Far North Queensland. He is a research associate at the College of Law at the Australian National University, and he recently completed his PhD examining Indigenous rights, Australia's native title system, and deliberative democracy. So welcome, Justin, and thank you for being here. And on Zoom, joining us amidst her busy schedule from Aotearoa, New Zealand, is Emily Beausoleil, who is a senior lecturer of politics at Victoria University in Wellington. As a political theorist, Emily explores the conditions, challenges, and possibilities of democratic engagement in diverse societies, with particular attention to the capacity for voice and listening in conditions of inequality. We're going to hear first some opening remarks from Justin and then from Emily to follow. Both will be responding to our question that we're posing today, and then I'll invite them to continue that conversation with some follow-up questions And of course, we will have time in the second half of the hour to bring in questions from the audience. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Justin.
Thank you, Adele. My name is Dr McCaul. I'm at ANU in the College of Law. I just want to begin by first acknowledging country and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay respects to their traditional owners past and present. I also want to just sort of extend a thank you as well to the invitation to participate in this 10 big questions on deliberative democracy. To begin my opening remarks, I will speak today as an Indigenous person that supports Indigenous claims to unceded sovereignty and the right to self-government and self-determination, claims that I view as uncontentious and able to be accommodated within Australian democracy. To the question, can deliberative democracy take root in colonial states? My answer to that question is that yes, and it already has. However, I said that deliberative democracy confronts several challenges in settler colonial societies that are so far being under-researched and theorised. And issues that come up in settler colonialism are sort of these entrenched paternalistic attitudes that the state has towards Indigenous people, and also the matter of, I guess, persistent institutional non-listening. Additionally, to find deliberative democracy as practiced by Indigenous people, one must look towards non-forum type settings, including public policy processes, agreement making, and Indigenous-led initiatives such as governance and nation building, not formal institutions of the states or indeed mini publics. A follow-up question may be asked is, how effective has it been, if at all, if it's taken root in settler colonial Australia? And that's probably a more difficult question that I can answer in 7 minutes, and it's probably best left to the Q&A session to follow after Emily's remarks. I also want to provide a comment too on a related question to today's one, and that is can deliberative democracy be decolonised? And in a recent publication on this question, I said that no, deliberative democracy cannot decolonise. I said that the question of whether deliberative democracy or anything for that matter can decolonise in states such as Australia is perhaps the wrong question. A better question is, what can deliberative democracy learn about and learn from settler colonialism? And I suggest that there is a lot that deliberative democracy can learn by understanding Indigenous peoples and knowing more about what matters to us and the conditions of settler colonialism in which we live. So in my discussion today, I want to present my ideas on how and where deliberative democracy is taking root in settler colonial Australia as done by Indigenous people. So do Indigenous people in Australia engage with deliberative democracy as a theory? I would say no. There's very little by way of Indigenous scholarship to date within the field of deliberative democracy, both in Australia and globally. And not many Indigenous political and legal scholars that I sort of follow and engage with have engaged with the theory of deliberative democracy. Do Indigenous people in Australia demonstrate and engage in practices which could be considered and described as deliberative? In my opinion, yes. To take a very recent and obvious example, consider the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart and the recent Voice to Parliament referendum. Just quickly, for those who may be unaware of those two events, since 1999 in Australia, constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the Indigenous peoples of Australia, has been the focus of much public deliberation since 2010, and it's included things like parliamentary committees, public advocacy campaigns. Then in 2016 and 17, Indigenous leaders undertook a deliberative process holding 12 regional dialogues across Australia with up to 100 invited Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to participate in the dialogues. And these dialogues were very much run like mini publics. So you had well-designed, professionally facilitated meetings. with Indigenous community members as well as legal experts on constitutional law and democracy. They could also be considered a form of enclave deliberation, in which Indigenous people were brought together to develop their own positions and preferences on constitutional change ahead of engaging with the state and ahead of the referendum that followed. Following on from the dialogues, a constitutional convention was held at Uluru in Central Australia, in which the Uluru Statement was produced. And in the Uluru Statement were three proposed structural changes to Australian democracy. One was a national truth-telling process. The second was a Makarrata Commission for treaty making, and the voice to Parliament to be enshrined in the Australian Constitution. There was also a bill introduced to the Australian Parliament, which passed in June 2023, which said that the voice would be a body known as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, which may make representations to the Parliament and Executive on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, had the forum been successful, and for those that don't know, the referendum was defeated in October 2023, but had the voice been successful, it would have been a new deliberative institution within Australia's system of democratic governance, enabling Indigenous people to have a greater say over law and policy making on Indigenous issues. Professor Megan Davis, who's an Indigenous constitutional law expert and one of the prominent leaders behind the Uluru Statement, called the Uluru Statement and its proposed structural reforms, including the voice, an Indigenous democratic innovation. Less visible than the voice and the Uluru Statement has been the spread of local, place-based participatory and deliberative democracy by Indigenous people within what is referred to in Australia as the native title system. So very quickly, what is native title? Native title is the recognition under Australian law of the pre-colonial rights to land of Indigenous people. And it's the outcome of a very famous High Court decision called the Mabo decision in 1992. So this legal recognition of rights and land has provided Indigenous people in Australia with a much greater ability to voice their concerns and opinions on law and policy matters at local, regional, and sometimes national scales with government, civil society groups, and businesses. However, the meaning of native title is contested. So under Australian law, it's a property right, but Indigenous people in Australia are attached also distinct political rights to native title, including the right to self-government. Political philosopher Philip Pettit argues that Western liberal democracies founded on colonisation, such as Australia, need to acquire a different conceptualisation of democracy, better able to accommodate the claims and aspirations of Indigenous people. Reflecting the ideals of deliberative democracy, what Pettit argues is that colonial states such as Australia need to augment electoral democracy with the inclusion of a contestatory dimension. So what I put forward in my own thesis around native title is that native title performs this contestatory dimension for Indigenous people in their engagement with the state. And if you think about it too, what was proposed in the voice was also a contestatory dimension enshrined in the Australian Constitution. What I argued was that the recognition of native title has therefore established an unintended deliberative democratic space for Indigenous people to contest the effects of colonialism and raise questions relating to Indigenous sovereignty, self-government, and legal pluralism. One of the examples I guess I focused on in my thesis research was a thing called caring for country, which is an Indigenous approach to environmental management. And so on the surface, when you look at caring for country, it appears as simply a practice of environmental management. But underlying that is also claims of self-determination and sovereignty that get brought up as part of the environmental planning and decision-making process. So it's a misunderstanding, I think, to view caring for country as simply land management, As Arkon Fung and others have argued, citizen participation in policy process is also deeply political. And I think that applies very much to a practice such as caring for country in Australia. Other areas in which Indigenous people are engaging in deliberative and democratic practices include the areas of health. So in 2015, a report, the Empowered Communities Report, which is an Indigenous-led initiative to strengthen shared decision-making between Indigenous communities and the government, had this to say about community-led programs to address Indigenous disadvantage. Aboriginal people have developed initiatives such as Empowered Communities and the National Agreement on Closing the Gap to provide a guide to how to engage with Indigenous communities that align with the ideals of deliberative democracy. These initiatives seek to embed a partnership approach and greater shared decision-making between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and all levels of government. So my point is to this, is to say that Indigenous modes of deliberative democracy do in fact exist, but are perhaps invisible to many. My final point comes from a paper, a 2009 paper on environmental justice and deliberative democracy by Jennifer Dodge, who states, deliberative democracy takes place in a range of spheres that includes but goes beyond the forum. Deliberative politics is about coming to agreements on meaning, and power is about the struggle to impose a particular meaning on a situation. This emphasis on meaning brings attention in empirical research back to the relationship between civil society and the state in deliberative democracy in ways that go beyond deliberative democratic deliberation within the forum. What I understand Dodge to be saying is that empirical research on deliberative democracy between citizens and states must be prepared to look beyond institutions and look for novel spaces in which civil society actors and the state participate in exchanging reasons. And this, I would say, equally applies to Indigenous people and the state in the matter of civil and colonialism. So now I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Justin. We're going to pass over to you, Emily.
Tēnā koutou. I'm Emily Beausoleil. I'm feeling very lucky to be virtually in the room with you all. I'm coming to you from whenua from land that is Te Atiawa, Taranaki Whānui, and Ngāti Toa. Our mana whenua, they hold territorial authority here and surround everything that I do, everything we study here, everything our students learn, everything we research. That's the context in which I'm coming to you from. Also, as you can hear in my voice, I also was raised in other shores in Western Canada and unceded territory of the Musqueam and Comox nations. And my ancestors actually come from England and France. So that's also with me in the room. Justin, thanks for opening. That was great to listen to you. I'm looking forward to being done so we can keep listening and talking with you. This question of taking root, our answers are a bit similar. I think we both have these two-pronged answers, this sense of it's already here in various forms if we're able to relax, we meaning especially Western researchers, relax a sense of what that looks like and what counts as deliberation. What are the markers? And our sense that our ways are the ways, relax that sense, we'll be able to see more and really value and recognize and make more because of what we recognize that's already practiced here. And I can talk about some of those examples. But also we're going to have to, the other part of that answer is to do so in a just or honorable way with integrity also requires dramatically changing how we practice deliberation, how we implement it in a number of ways. So the first thing that came to mind when I was this quandary of both here and could possibly never be here if we don't do this right, those are both true, was something that a Samoan leader who's living in the town of Porirua, just up the road from me, where they're working with mana whenua there, Ngāti Toa, to make a citizens' assembly, a climate assembly, but in partnership honoring Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is the treaty that actually gives me any right to stand here. It gives our democracy any ability to claim legitimacy. It's through those rights and responsibilities to tangata whenua that anyone who is not Maori makes home here. And those are the terms for living. trying to honor those in the way that Citizens Assembly is taking shape. And in this meeting with a number of Pacifica leaders that wanted to meet with Ngāti Toa to say, hey, I'm really interested in this, but let's talk about the terms you're using, what it could look like. One of the Samoan leaders there said, when I hear the word democracy, it leaves me cold. And when I hear deliberation and the way you describe it, I get excited because it actually sounds like something deeply familiar that I'm hearing from a Pacific tradition taking off elsewhere. And I think that speaks to a long history, reasons why it leaves you cold. You know, we get excited about deliberation because it potentially invigorates democratic practice and creates places for meaningful voice for people that aren't presently within our maybe more formal politics. So we might be left cold by the status quo of representative politics, but actually democracy itself has been wielded as a weapon in settler colonial contexts. So I think about here, the very first parliament implemented at a time when the population was 50% tangata whenua, 50% settlers, and they deliberately designed that parliamentary body so that there was a real limit on the ability to be proportionally represented. There were only 4 seats allowed in the settler law that was never meant to be the law of the land for everyone, limiting what would have been more like 12 to 14 to 16 seats at the time. And you carry on all the way through to now where numbers are wielded as a weapon, majority rule is wielded as a weapon. You can see that in the vote to parliament. No campaign and the success of that. Here they're talking about a treaty principles bill, again, generated not in meaningful dialogue with treaty partners, but by certain parties in government and pushed through wanting to have a referendum again, using those same tools, using numbers as a weapon. So across the board, even at local council, you can vote out any seat that's secured to allow any single voice of Māori representation at the local council. It can be up until recently voted out by a petition of even only 5% of that community's population. So numbers as weapon. And I think about democracy designed to prevent Māori voice is chronic within the way that democracy has rolled out in this place. And deliberation is meant to check some of that. It's meant to be a place where reason trumps power. But we know demographic representativeness, which is a part of a lot of these instances, is also a way to overrepresent settler voices. And if you actually have settler discourse and norms and practices and protocols be normalized and baked into this ongoing setting of ongoing settler colonialism, then not only the numbers of those who are representing demographics, but also what feels normal, natural, persuasive, reasonable, that can have a force of its own in those ostensibly deliberative contexts. So you're working against the grain continually to be heard, to be resonant, to be understood, to persuade. And so deliberative democracy too, as well as aggregative democracy, we see overrepresentation of settler voices, and that can easily just reinforce those dynamics of settler dominance more broadly. So there's good reasons to be skeptical, suspicious. There's deep justified distrust, actually. There's a lot that I think we have to do if this is a value and if this is worth fighting for and trying to translate into, and as you say, take root. There's a lot we're going to have to do. And a big part of that, though, is actually really unsettling our ideas of what it looks like. So it was through working, especially in this context, and in the context of learning about protocols of encounter from various Māori, iwi, and hapu, and what do they know about how to structure engagement so that listening and deep dialogue are possible, deliberation in a sense, say. And it was so pointedly different the way this was structured. For instance, it blew my mind, but you could see deliberation happen, but it happened not in a particular site per se, or in a demarcated single event, but actually through structures and protocols that were also physically situated in particular places in particular times to allow for the deep listening that could happen. So in the context of learning about tikanga in the Rangawhakata context up in Manituke, on the East Coast, very indebted to learning from Tēnā and Ngāpaki Mōtara in that context for a few years, and watching how the protocol sequence structured like a call and response system, so that every stage of the protocol allows you to meet anybody at the gate, be they enemy, friend, someone in need of help, someone here to fight, be able to meet them, understand what they're bringing, how they're coming in, and then decide what to do from there. And every stage of the protocol then opens up clarity around the next step. And sometimes you get into the deep part of the house. Sometimes you take your shoes off at the door and you're able to step into the wharenui, the house, and be able to have that deep listening-based dialogue where we actually have egos left at the door. We're actually here to see what emerges between us when we bring our differences to bear, which is, I think, what we like to think when we talk about deliberation having value. That's what we're seeking in some ways. But sometimes you can get to that point of getting into that deep dialogue, but you only are able to get to that because of this really precise, highly developed protocol sequence that allows everything to be said that needs to be said in a place that is safe and to say it. Protocols that allow us to feel the physical context and the histories of that place speak to us to inform what is happening, stages that allow us to build relationships in a meaningful way and identify connections before we get into the really difficult weaving of our views, and so on. So it was like a completely different structure that was enabling the very thing we say we care about in deliberative democracy. And I think that was very eye-opening for me about what it looks like. Ceding our certainty and ceding control about what it looks like will allow us to see more, but it also means we're more honorable as we come into a relationship around this. And I guess the last thing I'll say, but there's a number of other things hopefully I'll be able to come back to, but one thing that comes to mind in this context was when I first went into that context to learn, and I was learning as a democratic scholar about what helps listening, it was my research questions that were the framework for that question. And I went into this house and into these protocols and into this deep, deep history of real insight and experience about what enables us to listen. But I was shaken in that context and called to account. And I was asked to notice my presumption that I am setting the context of inquiry and understanding and even politics. My question and my frames were the context in which I was working. And I was asked to notice how even presuming to be the context for inquiry is itself limiting our ability to hear the difference and to bring ourselves in relationship alongside others' differences. And this connects to something that Professor Melinda Weber, who's in education in Auckland University here, challenged all Western researchers. She said, the number one mistake you make, she said to this room, was you mistake Maori for content and not the context. And all I want you to do is to notice your cultural difference, bring it alongside that of others in the context of ongoing unceded sovereignty and Te Ao Maori worldview and practices that are the very context for everything that we do in this place. So I guess the challenge for me is how can we feel even the question of can deliberative democracy take root? How is that the little thing? How can we bring that as the little thing inside the broader context of addressing ongoing settler colonialism and honoring the ways, the laws, the institutions, the practices that exist in the places where we live? How can we feel that context more and more, the structure and history in every particular moment and the context that surrounds everything we do as researchers and practitioners in this world? Yeah, and the last thing I'll say in that context that comes up is because we're working from context, because we're in actual relationship with the places and the peoples in whose context that we live and work and think and want to deliberation to flourish in, it's also going to be always and ever place-based. So I've had some questions come up of like, oh, well, that sounds nice in that context, but we can't universalize that. We can't generalize that. Well, that wouldn't work in this place. That wouldn't work in this place. Actually, to work from context and to work from place and to work from the authority and honoring the authority of those whose land on which we live is to be deeply place-based, actually, and is to temper the desire to universalize and generalize and to find the checkbox answer to this question. It's going to look like a million things. It already looks like a million things. And so bringing a real tempering of that desire to look for the one answer and really working from being situated and from the places in which we live as I think part of the key to moving forward. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll leave it at that for now.